June 6, 1944. The skeletal remains of a once thriving town stretched across the horizon, half-destroyed buildings leaning precariously, smoke rising from shattered rooftops, and the ground scarred with craters from endless artillery fire. Mud clung to every surface, making each step a struggle, and the air was thick with the scent of gunpowder and wet earth. From this chaos, American Sherman tanks emerged, their olive-green hulls coated in grime, tracks crunching over debris, moving with a deliberate, almost mechanical patience. Inside, the crews were tense but methodical, eyes scanning every corner, hands on levers and triggers, hearts beating to the rhythm of an unfolding battle they had trained for, yet could never fully anticipate. On the surrounding ridges, German 75mm cannons were readied, their crews sweating under the strain, fingers tightening on the triggers, eyes fixed on the advancing tanks. The doctrine was clear. These medium American tanks were supposed to crumble under the first impact, their thin armor no match for the high-velocity shells. But as the lead Sherman approached, the first round struck, denting armor plates, throwing sparks, yet leaving the massive tank relatively unscathed. Panic flickered across the faces of the gunners. Shell after shell hit its side, bouncing off, shattering nearby rubble. Yet the tank pressed on, its engine growling, its turrets rotating with precision, firing back at enemy positions with calm, controlled efficiency. In that moment, the battlefield shifted. The Americans weren't just advancing, they were rewriting what the Germans thought was possible. Every Sherman that survived the first volley became a psychological weapon, as much as a mechanical one. For the German artillery crews, trained to expect immediate destruction of light tanks, this was a jolt. A living proof that the weapons they had relied upon for years would no longer guarantee victory. Relentless advance of the Sherman tanks through mud, smoke, and shattered buildings was not just a tactical maneuver. It was a statement, a foreshadowing of how mechanized warfare had evolved and how old assumptions about armor, firepower, and intimidation could no longer dictate the outcome of battle. Perched atop a jagged ridge overlooking the shattered town, the German 75mm artillery crew braced against the morning chill, their uniforms smeared with dust and sweat. Each man's face was a study in tension, gritted teeth, narrowed eyes, and the faint tremor of anticipation that only hours of continuous warfare could ingrain. The massive barrels of the cannons pointed outward like the fangs of some metallic beast, polished steel, catching glimmers of sunlight through the drifting smoke. Captain Friedrich Vogel barked orders, his voice slicing through the cacophony of distant explosions and gunfire. Feuerbereit! Schnell! Schneller! Target those tanks before they reach the town. Hands moved in precise, practiced motions. Shells were rammed into breaches, breech blocks locked, and the firing lanyards tested with a cold snap. Every movement was meticulous, drilled into muscle memory over years of campaign. Poland, France, Russia, yet the weight of expectation pressed heavier now, as if the guns themselves sensed the danger of failure. Through the haze, the lead Sherman rolled over broken pavement, tracks grinding against rubble, its turret swinging with mechanical certainty. Vogel squinted through his sight, adjusting for distance, wind, and angle. His stomach tightened. He had been trained to trust his 75 millimeter, to believe that nothing in a medium tank's frame could withstand a direct hit. Yet as the Sherman drew nearer, that familiar confidence faltered. The first shot thundered from the cannon, reverberating through the ridge. But even as the shell impacted, the tank did not topple or ignite as expected. Sparks flew, smoke puffed, and debris scattered. Yet the Sherman pressed on, almost taunting in its resilience. The gunners exchanged uneasy glances. Their doctrine had failed them. Years of calculations and assumptions about armor thickness and shell velocity now seemed insufficient against these moving fortresses. Each shell fired felt heavier in their hands, as if the artillery itself weighed the truth of their obsolescence. Vogel's voice rose again, sharper, desperate, but even he could sense the subtle tremor in his crew. Fear not of death, but of irrelevance. The advancing Shermans were not just machines. They were harbingers of a new battlefield, where traditional artillery could no longer claim supremacy. Every second that ticked away without a destroyed Sherman deepened the realization. Today, the rules of engagement had changed, and the German 75 millimeter cannons were no longer the unquestioned arbiters of armored warfare. The Sherman tanks rumbled across the cratered street, their engines churning mud and dust into the cold morning air. The lead tank's turret swiveled, scanning the shattered buildings and exposed ridges where German gunners lay in wait. Then, with a deafening roar, the first 75 millimeter shell slammed into its frontal armor. A cloud of smoke and debris erupted, hurling chunks of masonry into the air. Captain Vogel and his gunners held their breath, expecting the tank to erupt in fire, to shatter into twisted metal. But it didn't. Through the haze, the Sherman remained upright, its treads rolling over rubble as if mocking the explosion. Sparks from the impact scattered across its steel surface, but the hull held firm. The gunner inside the tank peered through the periscope, eyes wide with urgency, but unshaken. Another shell struck the side. Another puff of smoke, another jolt, but the armor absorbed the blow. Vogel's hands tightened on the firing lanyard, knuckles white. He fired again, and again, but each round seemed to bounce harmlessly. Each impact met with the tank's relentless advance. The psychological shock rippled through the German crew. Every assumption drilled into them about armor, shell power, and tactical superiority was crumbling before their eyes. This was no ordinary battlefield encounter. It was a confrontation with a technological revelation. The Sherman was not merely surviving. It was surviving with ease. The rumble of its engine, the clatter of tracks over broken stone, became an audible statement of dominance. From the Sherman's turret, Sergeant Jameson shouted orders to his crew, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Keep moving. Don't stop. Hit anything that moves, but don't let them pin us." The Americans had been trained to expect resistance, but the German gunners had not expected tanks to shrug off direct hits with such calm, almost mechanical indifference. Each surviving shell planted seeds of disbelief, fear, and awe. In those tense, smoking seconds, the battlefield's balance shifted. What had seemed like an inevitable German victory, artillery supremacy over armor, now teetered on the edge of surprise and panic. The Shermans, seemingly invincible to the 75mm, forced a reevaluation of tactics in real time. The ridge that had once been a position of dominance now felt precarious, the gunners' hands trembling, not from the recoil of their own weapons, but from the dawning realization the Americans had brought something new to the war, something that could no longer be ignored. And the Germans were learning, painfully, that survival on the battlefield had acquired a new definition. The German 75mm crews, perched on the ridge above the shattered town, exchanged frantic glances. Sweat streaked down faces hardened by years of combat, yet their eyes betrayed disbelief. The Sherman tanks, rolling steadily through mud and rubble, had absorbed shells that should have torn them apart. Orders barked down the line did little to calm the tension. Every calculated shot seemed to vanish against the Americans' armored hulks. Corporal Heinrich Bauer yanked the breech open, loaded another shell, and fired. The recoil slammed his shoulder, rattling his teeth. But when he squinted through the scope, the Sherman continued its advance, seemingly untouched. A cold knot of panic grew in his stomach. He had seen Allied tanks destroyed before. He had seen armor pierced and crews thrown into the dirt. But these machines defied every expectation. Across the ridge, Lieutenant Krause's voice rose above the clamor, tense and sharp. "Aim for the tracks. Disable them." Orders cascaded down like artillery shells themselves, but the Shermans adjusted, skirting craters and debris, turning their turrets toward German positions. Another shot struck the side of the lead tank, a shower of sparks flying. Yet still, it moved. The crews began whispering in disbelief. Murmurs of "unmöglich," impossible, slipped from their lips. The psychological impact was immediate and brutal. Men trained for years in precision and timing were forced into improvisation. The rhythm of warfare they had relied upon, load, fire, observe, adjust, was shattered. Each hit that failed to immobilize the Shermans echoed like a verdict against their training, against their doctrine. Some gunners froze entirely, hands trembling over shells and lanyards, staring at the tanks that seemed to mock the very notion of destruction. From the American side, Sergeant Jameson's voice crackled over the intercom. "Keep moving. Don't let them get a bead on us." Inside the Sherman, the crew's coordination was flawless. Loader, gunner, driver. Every movement, precise, rehearsed, unbroken by the chaos around them. The contrast between disciplined, mechanical calm and German panic could not have been starker. By the time the last shell from the ridge struck the lead Sherman, the German crews had begun to understand the unthinkable. Survival against these tanks required more than skill. It demanded adaptation to an enemy that had already redefined the battlefield. In that moment, terror, awe, and confusion intertwined, leaving a mark not just on the ridge, but on the minds of every man who had dared to oppose them. The Sherman was more than a weapon. It was a psychological hammer, raking confidence, shaking doctrine, and forcing a reckoning with reality itself. The lead Sherman, its treads churning mud and rubble, crested a small rise and revealed the full scope of the battlefield. Behind it, a rolling line of armored steel followed, each tank moving with uncanny coordination, guns swiveling, turrets tracking every German position with precision. The town, once held by confident defenders, now echoed with the shrill whistle of shells and the rending cries of collapsing buildings. Smoke and dust swirled in the air, cutting visibility. Yet the Sherman crews advanced with unnerving calm. On the ridge, German infantry and artillery teams scrambled, attempting to regroup and find cover. Panicked orders collided with reality. Shells that should have smashed the tanks only glanced off reinforced armor, while counterfire from the Shermans began to rip through emplacements with devastating accuracy. Bauer and Krauss realized, almost simultaneously, that their line was untenable. The ridge. From within the tanks, the Americans pushed forward like a relentless wave. Machine guns swept across open streets, suppressing German riflemen, while 75mm main guns targeted fortified positions with brutal efficiency. Sergeant Jameson barked commands to his crew. "Left flank, move up. Keep the pressure. Don't give them time to regroup." Each Sherman seemed alive, a mechanical predator, turning what had been a defensive stronghold into a chaotic, collapsing front. As German soldiers retreated through mud and craters, morale collapsed under the dual weight of fear and awe. The Shermans had survived shots that would have felled any tank in previous battles. Men who had trained for months, even years, to defend against American armored tactics now found themselves running, improvising, and abandoning positions once considered secure. The psychological impact was complete. Discipline gave way to desperation. By late afternoon, the battlefield had transformed. Smoke rose from wrecked buildings, the air thick with the smell of cordite and scorched metal. Yet the Shermans continued their advance, their steel hulls glinting through the haze, a tangible symbol of American industrial ingenuity and tactical innovation. What had begun as a standard engagement became a vivid lesson for the German army. Their assumptions about tank warfare, about the effectiveness of the 75mm against modern American armor, were catastrophically wrong. In the minds of the survivors, a chilling realization set in. These tanks were not merely machines of war. They were agents of a new battlefield reality. Retreat was not just necessary. It was the only choice. The Sherman had rewritten the rules of engagement, and no ridge, no emplacement, no conventional tactic could withstand the combination of armor, firepower, and psychological dominance it brought to the field. As the Americans pushed deeper into the shattered town, the battle shifted from long-range duels to brutal, chaotic, close quarters. Streets, once bustling with civilians and commerce, had become narrow, killing corridors. Rubble from collapsed walls and buildings created natural choke points, and every corner could conceal a German soldier waiting to strike. Yet, the Shermans moved forward with surprising agility, their engines growling and treads crushing debris under relentless pressure. Inside the tanks, crews worked like clockwork. Loader, gunner, driver, and commander operated in perfect harmony, anticipating threats before they fully emerged. The 75mm cannons, which German intelligence had confidently assumed would easily pierce Sherman armor, bounced shots harmlessly off reinforced hulls. Each impact sent vibrations through steel, but the tanks pressed on, almost impervious. Their mobility and armor forced German soldiers tried everything. Anti-tank rifles, satchel charges, even desperate Molotov cocktails. Many watched in disbelief as their weapons either failed to penetrate or were rendered ineffective by the Sherman's low profile and maneuverability. When a shell struck a Sherman turret, it rattled the crew, but caused no catastrophic damage, leaving the tank to retaliate instantly with its own devastating fire. The streets echoed with the deafening roar of main guns, punctuated by the rattle of machine guns sweeping across alleyways. Civilians who had survived the bombardment peeked from broken windows, witnessing a warlike ballet of steel and fire. From their vantage, the Shermans seemed unstoppable, relentless engines of American innovation that no German cannon could contain. Bauer and Krauss, rallying what remained of their infantry, realized that holding a street meant nothing if the Shermans could simply outmaneuver and outgun them at every turn. By late afternoon, the psychological impact on German defenders was evident. Fear and confusion overtook tactical planning. Troops abandoned fortified positions, leaving behind equipment, vehicles, and sometimes entire squads. Sherman crews, however, maintained discipline and coordination, each movement calculated to exploit gaps, cover flanks, and suppress any remaining resistance. Even when tanks were damaged or temporarily immobilized, they became obstacles to the enemy rather than liabilities, protecting infantry and maintaining the forward momentum. The close quarters battle highlighted a brutal truth. The Sherman was not just a tank. It was a war-altering force. Its armor, firepower, and reliability had shattered assumptions, while its presence alone demoralized the most hardened German soldiers. By the time night fell, the town had changed hands completely. The German defense, built on decades of doctrine and experience, had crumbled in the face of relentless American armored ingenuity. As dusk settled over the ruined town, German commanders regrouped on the ridge, their faces etched with frustration and disbelief. Major Bauer and Oberleutnant Krauss studied the American advance, calculating angles and distances with a grim determination. Their 75mm PaK-40 cannons had always been lethal against tanks. At long range, the steel projectiles could tear through Panzer IVs and other medium armor with ease. Yet now, the enemy seemed different, almost unnervingly resilient. The Germans began adjusting their firing positions, angling barrels, and timing volleys with painstaking precision. Observers marked weak points on each approaching Sherman, hoping to find the armor's vulnerability. A tank's turret rattled under a direct hit. Smoke curled from the engine compartment, but the Sherman kept rolling. Another shell struck the glacis, glanced off at a perfect angle, and the crew inside barely flinched, returning fire immediately. From their hidden vantage, the Germans could see the effect of every hit. Unlike previous battles, where a direct shell meant destruction or fire, Shermans absorbed punishment and continued to advance. Each failed attempt chipped away at the confidence of the defenders, while the Americans pressed forward with calm coordination, using terrain and debris for cover, their gunners scanning for weak spots with disciplined patience. Desperation mounted. Soldiers tried creative tactics, stacking rubble to expose thinner armor, firing from elevated positions, even using multiple tanks as bait for concentrated fire. Yet each experiment confirmed the same reality. The Sherman's armor distribution and mechanical reliability made conventional 75mm anti-tank strategies almost obsolete in this engagement. The psychological toll was evident. Experienced gunners who had faced countless battles across France, Russia, and North Africa began second-guessing every shot. Hesitation spread like wildfire among the ranks. Fear of wasted shells or exposure to return fire slowed reactions. Meanwhile, Sherman crews, trained for aggression and precision, exploited every pause, maneuvering through streets and across open fields, using speed and firepower to dominate the battlefield. By nightfall, the Germans understood a grim truth. The Sherman was more than a tank. It was a battlefield equalizer. Their 75mm cannons, once symbols of invincibility, now tested the limits of American engineering and tactical discipline. Every shell fired that failed to penetrate reinforced armor became a lesson in humility, a reminder that assumptions in war could no longer substitute for adaptation. In the gray light of early morning, The Sherman crews moved like a single, well-oiled machine across the shattered town. Each tank followed precise orders, maintaining distance, covering each other's blind spots, and communicating with hand signals, flags, and low-frequency radios. Inside the hull, the crew worked in seamless synchronization. The commander scanning for threats, the gunner adjusting the turret, the loader cycling rounds efficiently, and the driver hugging the terrain, steering clear of rubble, craters, and collapsed buildings. From the German ridge, Major Bauer could see the problem clearly. Even when a Sherman was hit, the damage was rarely crippling. A dented hull or shattered track slowed it momentarily, but the crews quickly improvised repairs under fire. Smoke from a hit often misled the Germans into thinking the tank was out of action, only for it to push forward again, guns blazing, cutting a path through defensive positions with relentless precision. The Sherman's 75mm gun, paired with high-velocity armor-piercing rounds, allowed American crews to engage at distances that minimized exposure to German 75mm anti-tank fire. They exploited the town's narrow streets and ruined buildings, using line of sight and cover to approach ridges while staying mostly protected from direct hits. Each advance was deliberate, combining speed, suppressive fire, and calculated maneuvers, turning the Sherman from a mere tank into a mobile fortress. German infantry tried to support their guns with Panzer Fausts and Molotovs, but even close-range attacks often failed. The Sherman's thick frontal armor deflected most shaped charges, while side skirts and clever angling further reduced vulnerability. Observing this, Oberleutnant Krauss realized that no single tactic could stop these tanks. Coordination, concentration of fire, and careful planning were the only options. But even those were not guaranteed to succeed. Meanwhile, inside the Sherman, tension and adrenaline coexisted with calm training. Crews had drilled for months, learning to maintain composure under bombardment, communicate silently, and prioritize targets. Each hit taken only strengthened their resolve, proving that the combination of armor, speed, and teamwork could outmatch the enemy's best anti-tank efforts. By mid-morning, the battlefield had transformed into a study in contrast. German gunners meticulously aiming, anxious for every shot to count, while American Shermans moved forward with unstoppable rhythm, each tank supporting the other, exploiting the stakes, and systematically breaking through defensive lines. It was no longer a fight of individual skill. It was a contest of doctrines, technology, and the psychology of endurance under fire. By late morning, the reality of the Sherman's resilience began to unsettle the German defenders. Major Bauer and his officers huddled behind sandbags and the ruins of what had once been a schoolhouse, furiously scribbling coordinates and adjusting firing angles. Every ridge seemed like a death trap. Every tank that emerged from a collapsed street seemed invincible, shrugging off direct hits that would have destroyed lesser machines. In a desperate bid, the Germans deployed ad hoc tactics. Infantry squads with Panzer Fausts and Panzer Schrecks moved close to cover, trying to ambush Shermans at blind corners. Explosives were planted along narrow alleyways, and the artillery tried indirect fire to create choke points. Yet, each Sherman's mobility turned these measures into a gamble. Even when tracks were damaged, crews crawled out, repaired them, and rejoined the advance. Smoke from hits only disguised the tank's continued presence. As soon as the German gunners adjusted for what they thought were destroyed targets, the same tanks reappeared, gun turrets swiveling to maintain pressure. From above, observation balloons and reconnaissance planes reported the Sherman formations, but the German 75mm crews were increasingly demoralized. The combination of accurate American gunners, rapid fire coordination, and strategic use of cover meant that every shot fired had to be perfect, an impossible expectation under constant bombardment. Bauer watched in disbelief as a Sherman angled its armor just so, bouncing rounds that should have penetrated, while the crew returned fire with deadly precision. Meanwhile, the Americans adapted as well. Sherman crews began using bounding overwatch, alternating movement and fire to keep German guns suppressed while advancing. Each tank supported the other, creating a moving fortress that slowly but inexorably pushed the defenders back. Psychological warfare played its part. The Germans could not predict which Sherman would advance next or where its main gun would target, creating a constant state of tension. The town itself became a chaotic chessboard. Buildings turned into obstacles, streets into narrow killing zones, and rubble into temporary armor. Yet the Shermans maneuvered with a combination of brute force and tactical ingenuity that left the Germans scrambling for solutions. Even the introduction of heavier 88mm anti-tank guns could not guarantee success. Each engagement required time the Germans did not have, and patience was fading fast. By noon, the once confident German defenders had become cautious and reactive. Their 75mm cannons, designed to dominate earlier campaigns, were proving inadequate against tanks that could absorb punishment and deliver counterfire with lethal efficiency. Every failed attempt to halt a Sherman was another lesson in the mismatch between German expectations and American battlefield innovation. By early afternoon, the American Sherman tanks had begun to pierce the German defensive perimeter, turning what had been a tense standoff into a chaotic retreat for the defenders. Dust and smoke filled the ruined streets of the town, mingling with the acrid scent of gunpowder as the Shermans advanced in tightly coordinated formations. Each tank moved with calculated precision, their hulls angled to deflect incoming 75mm shells while maintaining suppressive fire on German positions. Lieutenant Jameson, commanding a Sherman platoon from the lead tank, kept his eyes on the crumbling buildings and the elevated ridges where German gunners hid. "Keep moving, keep firing," he barked over the radio, his voice barely audible over the roar of engines and cannon blasts. The Shermans worked as a single unit, supporting one another as they pushed through streets lined with debris and overturned vehicles. The German 75mm crews, expecting easy kills, were increasingly frustrated as rounds glanced off thick frontal armor or hit at ineffective angles, forcing repeated corrections under heavy fire. Infantry squads followed the tanks, taking advantage of the cover the steel beasts provided. Rifle fire and grenades targeted any German soldier who dared to show themselves, turning every attempted counterattack into a deadly gamble. The Shermans' cannons, firing high explosive rounds, shredded barricades and demolished fortified positions, clearing paths where no human infantry alone could have advanced. From a distance, German officers could only watch in disbelief. The Sherman, once thought of as a lightly armored vehicle, had proven itself resilient beyond expectation. It absorbed hits that would have immobilized other tanks and responded with devastating force, forcing German infantry to rethink both strategy and morale. Observers noted that the psychological effect was as significant as the physical destruction. German soldiers hesitated, fired prematurely, or abandoned positions entirely, unable to match the Shermans' combination of firepower, speed, and coordination. As the afternoon sun dipped lower, the town's defensive lines were crumbling. Smoke rose from shattered walls, and the occasional explosion of a destroyed Sherman created brief panic, only for other tanks to advance immediately in its place. The Americans exploited every breach, consolidating gains and keeping German units off balance. The once proud 75mm cannons, capable of dominating earlier battlefields, now seemed relics, insufficient against the relentless, well-coordinated American armor. By the day's end, the German defenders had been pushed back, their positions in ruins, and their confidence shattered. The Sherman tanks had proven that survival against the feared 75mm cannons was not only possible, but could decisively turn the tide of battle when combined with disciplined tactics and unyielding momentum. As the American Shermans pressed forward, German officers scrambled to coordinate counterattacks, realizing that their standard defensive doctrine was failing against these surprisingly resilient tanks. From the ridges and ruined buildings, 75mm cannons fired in short, calculated bursts, aiming for the tracks or thinner side armor. Yet, even when shells struck, the Shermans often shrugged off the impacts, their reinforced frontal armor absorbing hits that would have destroyed older models. Oberleutnant Heinrich Weber surveyed the battlefield from a crumbling church tower, binoculars pressed to his eyes. Smoke curled from broken tanks, and the ground trembled with the constant rumble of engines. His mind raced. How to stop this relentless advance? He barked orders to reposition his crews, instructing them to fire from concealed positions and use the rubble as improvised cover. mines, and anti-tank obstacles were hastily deployed in streets, but the Americans had already anticipated such tactics, their tanks maneuvering with disciplined precision to avoid predictable traps. Meanwhile, small German infantry squads attempted daring flanking attacks, armed with Panzerfausts and satchel charges. They moved under the cover of debris, creeping toward the vulnerable sides of the Sherman tanks. But every attempt was met with suppressive fire from the supporting American riflemen. Each explosion that did touch a Sherman merely slowed its advance temporarily. The tanks continued to push forward, and the Americans adjusted their formations, ensuring no single vehicle became isolated. The Germans were forced to innovate on the fly. Some commanders tried pairing multiple 75mm guns to focus fire on a single target, attempting to overwhelm the tank's armor. Others coordinated artillery strikes, hoping to hit the Shermans before they reached critical positions. Yet, the Americans' rapid communication and adaptability outpaced the German improvisation. Radios crackled with orders and updates, allowing Sherman crews to rotate damaged tanks out of the front line while maintaining momentum with minimal disruption. By late afternoon, the battlefield had transformed into a dynamic, almost chaotic contest of adaptation versus resilience. German soldiers, trained to fear the Sherman, but unprepared for its tenacity, began retreating from exposed positions. Officers noted the growing demoralization. The once confident defenders now hesitated, misjudged distances, and fired with less precision. Their psychological edge eroded by the tank's unexpected durability. It became painfully clear the Sherman was not just a machine of war, but a tactical disruptor. It forced the Germans to rethink centuries-old strategies, showing that armor combined with coordination and tactical foresight could render even formidable 75mm cannons insufficient. The afternoon ended with German lines in disarray, their best defenses neutralized, and the Americans consolidating gains with calculated efficiency. Inside the armored hull of the Sherman, Sergeant James Miller wiped sweat from his brow as the engine growled beneath him. The cramped interior smelled of oil, metal, and gunpowder, a constant reminder of the machine's power and vulnerability. Each crew member moved with precision, trained to operate as a single unit. The driver monitored the terrain. The gunner aligned the 75mm cannon. The loader prepared shells. And the commander coordinated maneuvers with radio calls to neighboring tanks. Every motion was rehearsed, every command efficient. The Sherman was only as effective as the teamwork inside. From the outside, the tank appeared bulky, almost lumbering, yet it moved with surprising agility over the muddy, cratered terrain of the Western European battlefield. Its sloped armor, an innovation inspired by earlier combat lessons, deflected incoming shells reducing the impact of German 75mm rounds that had once decimated lighter armored vehicles. Miller adjusted his aim, firing a round at a partially concealed cannon nest. The shell struck true, sending splintered rubble into the air and silencing the enemy gun. Around him, the Sherman's mechanical systems hummed reliably. The transmission, the engine, the gun breech, each element designed to endure harsh conditions while maintaining combat readiness. Outside, dust, smoke, and the acrid smell of explosives clouded the battlefield. Infantrymen ducked behind shattered walls, their eyes darting nervously at the advancing Sherman. The Germans had expected their 75mm cannons to obliterate these American tanks, but the Shermans kept moving, pushing forward despite near misses and armor-piercing rounds striking their sides. Miller felt a mixture of adrenaline and calm, the result of rigorous training combined with trust in the machine. Every shell loaded, every maneuver executed, reinforced the feeling that their vehicle was more than metal. It was a psychological weapon, breaking the morale of defenders who had overestimated their advantage. As the Sherman climbed over debris-strewn streets, the radio crackled with orders from headquarters. Advance to Grid 17. Flank the town center. Cover infantry. Miller relayed the commands to his crew, adjusting speed and gun elevation simultaneously. Outside, the once imposing German artillery now seemed fragmented, its crews struggling to keep pace with the Sherman's relentless progression. Observing through the periscope, Miller noted the German soldiers' hesitation and miscalculations, realizing that the tank's presence alone disrupted not only their formations, but their mental state. In that moment, the Sherman revealed the true genius of its design, a balance of durability, firepower, mobility, and crew efficiency. Each tank that rolled forward was not just surviving 75mm hits, it was actively reshaping the battlefield, forcing the Germans to confront an armored reality they had been unprepared for. The Shermans were more than machines. They were embodiments of tactical innovation, capable of redefining what infantry and armor engagements could achieve in modern warfare. The smoke finally cleared over the shattered town, revealing a battlefield that spoke louder than any report or strategy meeting ever could. American Sherman tanks, once considered vulnerable by German commanders, had not only survived multiple 75mm hits, but had forced the defenders into disarray, exposing weaknesses in German anti-tank doctrine. Military analysts would later study photographs of bent shells, scorched earth, and overturned German artillery, noting how the combination of sloped armor, mechanical reliability, and coordinated crew operation had turned the tide in favor of the Allies. In command bunkers miles away, officers pored over maps and battle logs, acknowledging a painful truth. Their calculations had underestimated the Sherman's resilience and overestimated the destructive power of the 75mm cannon against these medium tanks. Reports highlighted instances where crews inside the Sherman remained unharmed even as rounds penetrated nearby walls and structures, emphasizing the psychological impact on both sides. The Germans, once confident in their ability to halt American advances with concentrated artillery, now faced the reality that the Shermans could absorb punishment, maintain mobility, and deliver retaliatory fire with devastating accuracy. Historians later described the engagement as a pivotal lesson in armored warfare. Firepower alone does not guarantee battlefield dominance. Coordination, crew training, mechanical reliability, and tactical innovation could decisively alter outcomes, as demonstrated by the Shermans. The once dreaded 75mm cannons were reduced to symbols of miscalculation, while the American tanks emerged as versatile instruments, capable of shaping entire campaigns. Infantry units, observing the tanks' movements, adapted quickly, understanding that the Shermans' advance created new opportunities for flanking, suppressive fire, and combined operations that German forces were ill-prepared to counter. Ultimately, the battle underscored a broader strategic principle. The evolution of technology and tactics is inseparable from human decision-making. The Sherman tank was more than an armored vehicle. It was a lesson in adaptation, resilience, and the unpredictability of modern combat. Its presence on the battlefield forced commanders on both sides to rethink assumptions, revise strategies, and most importantly, recognize that underestimating an opponent's innovation could lead to catastrophic consequences.